It all started with a simple fence. Or at least, it was supposed to be simple. I had just moved into the neighborhood, a quiet suburban area with neatly trimmed lawns and houses that all looked like they had been cut from the same cookie cutter. The kind of place where everyone smiles at you, but secretly judges the color of your curtains. I wasn't looking for trouble. All I wanted was a little privacy. My backyard faced the street, and I didn't like the idea of strangers peeking in while I was grilling or relaxing with a book. So, I decided to build a fence. Not a massive one, just a modest wooden fence, 6 feet tall, enough to keep prying eyes out. I even checked the local zoning laws to make sure I was within the limits. Everything seemed fine until the HOA got involved. The Homeowners Association, or HOA as everyone called it, was the unofficial ruler of the neighborhood. They had rules for everything: what color you could paint your house, how tall your grass could be, even what kind of mailbox you were allowed to have. I had heard stories about how strict they were, but I didn't think much of it. That was my first mistake. The day after I started building the fence, I received a letter in my mailbox. It was from the HOA, and it wasn't a friendly welcome note. The letter stated that my fence violated community guidelines. Apparently, fences over 4 feet tall were prohibited unless approved by the HOA board. I was stunned. I had already bought the materials and started construction. I tried to reason with them, explaining that I needed the fence for privacy, but they weren't having it. The HOA president, a woman named Karen, of course, told me in no uncertain terms that the fence had to go. She even threatened me with daily fines if I didn't comply. I was furious. I had spent my hard-earned money on that fence, and I wasn't about to let some power-hungry HOA dictate what I could or couldn't do on my own property. But I knew I couldn't just ignore them. They had the power to make my life miserable. So, I decided to play smart. I spent the next few days researching HOA bylaws, zoning regulations, and property rights. That's when I stumbled upon an interesting loophole. While the HOA had strict rules about fences, there were no specific regulations about other types of structures, like walls. And that's when the idea hit me. If I couldn't build a fence, maybe I could build something else. Something bigger. Something that would make Karen and the HOA regret ever messing with me. I called a few contractors, ran some calculations, and within a week, I had a plan. I was going to build a castle. Not a metaphorical one, a real, honest-to-goodness, medieval-style castle wall around my property. It was going to be glorious. The first step was to get the necessary permits. I knew the HOA would be watching me like a hawk, so I made sure everything was by the book. I submitted detailed plans to the city, including blueprints for a security wall that just so happened to look like something straight out of a medieval fortress. To my surprise, the city approved it without much fuss. Apparently, as long as the structure met safety codes and didn't violate any zoning laws, they didn't care what it looked like. I even got a call from the zoning office complimenting the unique design. That was the first victory, but I knew the real battle was just beginning. The next morning, I woke up early to the sound of heavy machinery pulling up to my house. I had hired a construction crew to start digging the foundation for the castle wall. The noise must have alerted Karen because she was at my doorstep within minutes, her face red with anger. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" she demanded, pointing at the excavator that was now digging a trench around my property. I smiled calmly and handed her a copy of the city-approved permit. "Just making some improvements to my property," I said. "You know, for security purposes." Karen's eyes widened as she scanned the document. "This is ridiculous," she shouted. "You can't just build a castle in the middle of a suburban neighborhood." I shrugged. "According to the city, I can. And since the HOA doesn't have any rules against walls, I think I'm well within my rights." Karen stormed off, muttering something about calling an emergency HOA meeting. Over the next few days, the construction continued at a steady pace. The trench was dug, the foundation was laid, and the first stones of the castle wall began to rise. It was impossible to miss, a massive, imposing structure that stood out like a sore thumb in the sea of beige houses. The neighbors were divided. Some thought it was the coolest thing they'd ever seen, while others were clearly on Karen's side, whispering about how it was ruining the aesthetic of the neighborhood. I didn't care. I was too busy enjoying the look on Karen's face every time she drove by and saw the wall getting taller and taller. The HOA, of course, tried to stop me. They sent me letters, threatened fines, and even tried to get the city to revoke my permit. But I had done my homework. Every time they came at me with a new complaint, I had a legal response ready. I even hired a lawyer to make sure I was covered. Karen was furious, but there was nothing she could do. The wall was legal, and there was no rule in the HOA bylaws that could stop me. By the end of the second week, the wall was nearly complete. It was 10 feet tall, made of solid stone, and topped with battlements that gave an authentic medieval look. I even added a few decorative touches, like torches and a coat of arms above the gate. It was over the top, and I loved every inch of it. But I wasn't done yet. The wall was just the beginning. I had bigger plans that would make Karen's head spin. The next phase of my project was to add a tower. Not just any tower, but a full-on watchtower with a flagpole and a balcony. I wanted to make it clear that this wasn't just a wall. It was a statement. A statement that I wasn't going to be pushed around by the HOA or anyone else. The construction crew got to work on the tower, and within days, it began to take shape. It was taller than the wall, standing at 15 feet, and it gave me a perfect view of the entire neighborhood. I could see Karen's house from up there, and I made a point of waving every time I caught her glaring at me from her driveway. The neighborhood was buzzing with gossip. People were talking about the castle house nonstop. Some thought it was hilarious, while others were clearly annoyed. Karen, of course, was leading the charge against me. She organized a petition to get the HOA to change the bylaws and ban unsightly structures, but it didn't gain much traction. Most of the neighbors were too entertained by the drama to take her seriously. Meanwhile, my castle was becoming a local landmark. Kids would ride their bikes by just to catch a glimpse of it, and I even had a few people stop by to take pictures. It was exactly the kind of attention I had hoped for. Karen, on the other hand, was fuming. She couldn't stand the fact that I had outsmarted her, and she was determined to find a way to bring me down. But I was ready for whatever she threw at me. The castle was my fortress, and I wasn't about to let anyone take it away from me. As the tower neared completion, Karen's desperation became more apparent. She started showing up at my property unannounced, clipboard in hand, inspecting every inch of the construction site for any possible violation. One afternoon, she marched up to me while I was supervising the workers, her face twisted in frustration. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she spat, waving a stack of papers in my face. "Well, I've got news for you. The HOA has just passed a new rule banning all structures over 8 feet tall. Your little castle is coming down." I raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "That's interesting," I said, crossing my arms. "But you can't enforce a new rule retroactively. My permits were approved before this rule was passed, so my castle is grandfathered in." "Nice try, though." Karen's face turned beet red, and she stormed off without another word. The tower was finished a few days later, and it was even more impressive than I had imagined. Standing at 15 feet tall, it loomed over the neighborhood like a sentinel. I added a few final touches, like a flag with my family crest, which I designed myself, and a weather vane shaped like a dragon. The kids in the neighborhood loved it, and I even started giving mini tours to curious neighbors who wanted to see the view from the top. Karen, of course, refused to acknowledge its existence. She would drive by with her nose in the air, pretending not to notice the growing crowd of onlookers gathered around my property. But Karen wasn't done yet. She called an emergency HOA meeting, and I decided to attend just to see what she had up her sleeve. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, and the room was packed with neighbors. Karen stood at the front, her usual smug expression replaced with one of barely contained rage. "This is an outrage," she declared, slamming her hand on the podium. "One homeowner cannot be allowed to turn our peaceful neighborhood into a circus. We must take action before this. This monstrosity sets a dangerous precedent." The room erupted into murmurs, with some people nodding in agreement and others rolling their eyes. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up and calmly addressed the crowd. "I understand that my castle might not be to everyone's taste," I said, "but I followed all the rules. I got the necessary permits, and I didn't violate any HOA bylaws. If the HOA wants to change the rules moving forward, that's fine. But you can't punish me for something that was perfectly legal when I did it. The room fell silent, and I could see the frustration on Karen's face. She had hoped to rally the neighborhood against me, but it was clear that not everyone was on her side. The meeting ended without any resolution, and Karen looked more determined than ever to bring me down. She started spreading rumors about me, claiming that my castle was a safety hazard and that it was lowering property values in the neighborhood. She even tried to convince the local news to run a story about the neighborhood eyesore, but they declined, saying it wasn't newsworthy. Meanwhile, my castle was gaining popularity online. I had posted a few pictures on social media, and they quickly went viral. People loved the idea of someone standing up to an overbearing HOA, and I started receiving messages from strangers all over the country, thanking me for inspiring them to fight back against their own HOAs. It was surreal, but also incredibly satisfying. Karen, however, was not giving up. She started filing complaints with the city, claiming that my castle was violating noise ordinances and creating a disturbance. She even called the fire department, insisting that the tower was a fire hazard. But every time an inspector came by, they left shaking their heads. Everything looks up to code, one of them told me after inspecting the tower. I don't know what her problem is. I just smiled and thanked him for his time. Karen's antics were becoming more and more ridiculous, and it was clear that she was running out of options. But then, one night, things took a turn for the worse. I was woken up by the sound of loud banging coming from outside. I grabbed a flashlight and rushed to the window, only to see Karen standing in my backyard, holding a hammer. She was trying to break one of the stones in the castle wall. I couldn't believe my eyes. I grabbed my phone and started recording as I confronted her. "What do you think you're doing?" I demanded, shining the flashlight at her face. Karen froze, her eyes wide with panic. I was just, this wall is a danger to the neighborhood," she stammered, clearly caught off guard. "You're trespassing," I said, keeping my voice calm. "And I have it all on video. I think the police will be very interested in seeing this." Karen dropped the hammer and ran off, but I knew this wasn't over. She had crossed the line, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. The next morning, I filed a police report and handed over the video evidence. The officers were shocked when they saw it, and they promised to look into the matter. Meanwhile, I posted the video online, and it quickly went viral. People were outraged that Karen would go to such lengths to destroy my property, and the backlash was swift. The HOA board, which had been mostly silent up until now, was forced to take action. They held an emergency meeting and voted to suspend Karen from her position as president pending an investigation. It was a small victory, but it felt like a turning point. For the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand. With Karen temporarily suspended from her position, the neighborhood felt a strange sense of calm. The constant letters, fines, and complaints had stopped, and for the first time in months, I could enjoy my castle without looking over my shoulder. But I knew better than to let my guard down. Karen was the type of person who didn't take defeat lightly, and I had no doubt she was plotting her next move. In the meantime, I decided to make the most of the situation. I started hosting small gatherings in my backyard, inviting neighbors over to see the castle up close. To my surprise, many of them were genuinely curious and even impressed by what I had built. Some even admitted that they had been quietly rooting for me all along, too afraid of Karen's wrath to say anything publicly. One evening, as I was giving a tour of the tower to a group of neighbors, I noticed a car parked across the street. It was Karen, watching us from a distance. She didn't approach, but the look on her face was enough to send a chill down my spine. It was a mix of anger, jealousy, and something else I couldn't quite place. I knew she wasn't done with me, but I refused to let her ruin the moment. I waved at her, a small, defiant gesture, and she drove off without a word. The next day, I received a letter from the HOA. It wasn't from Karen this time, but from the interim president, a man named Greg who had always been more reasonable than Karen. The letter stated that the HOA was considering revising its bylaws to allow for unique architectural features as long as they met certain guidelines. It was a clear attempt to compromise, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. My castle had forced the HOA to reconsider its rigid rules, and that was a victory in itself. But I also knew that Karen would fight tooth and nail to prevent any changes from being made. Sure enough, Karen wasn't about to let go of her power without a fight. She started rallying her remaining supporters, holding secret meetings, and spreading more rumors about me. She even tried to convince the city to revoke my permits, claiming that I had misrepresented my intentions when I applied for them. But her efforts were in vain. The city had already approved the permits, and they weren't about to reverse their decision based on Karen's baseless accusations. If anything, her constant complaints were starting to backfire. The city officials were growing tired of her antics, and even some of her former allies were beginning to distance themselves from her. Meanwhile, my castle was becoming more than just a personal project. It had become a symbol of resistance against overbearing HOAs, and people from all over the country were reaching out to me for advice. I started a blog where I shared my story and offered tips on how to navigate HOA rules without losing your sanity. It was empowering to know that my experience was helping others, and it gave me a renewed sense of purpose. But it also made me a bigger target for Karen, who was growing increasingly desperate. One night, I was woken up by the sound of sirens. I rushed to the window and saw flashing lights outside. My heart sank as I realized that the fire department was at my house. I ran outside to find a group of firefighters inspecting the castle wall. We received a report of a structural hazard, one of them explained. Someone claimed that your wall is unstable and could collapse at any moment. I knew immediately who had made the call. Karen had taken her harassment to a new level, and this time she had put people's lives at risk by wasting the fire department's time. Fortunately, the firefighters quickly determined that the wall was perfectly stable, and they left with a warning to Karen about making false reports. The incident was the final straw for many of the neighbors. Karen's behavior had gone from annoying to dangerous, and people were starting to see her for what she really was, a petty tyrant who would stop at nothing to get her way. The HOA board held another emergency meeting, and this time they voted to remove Karen from the board entirely. It was a unanimous decision, and the relief in the room was palpable. Karen was no longer in power, and the neighborhood could finally move forward. But Karen wasn't about to go quietly. The day after the vote, I woke up to find my castle vandalized. Someone had spray painted the words, "eyesore," and tear it down on the wall. I knew it was Karen, but without proof, there was nothing I could do. I cleaned up the graffiti and installed security cameras around the property. If she wanted to play dirty, I was ready. The final showdown came a few days later. Karen showed up at my house, her face twisted with rage. "You think you've won, don't you?" she spat. "But this isn't over. I'll make sure you regret what you've done." I stood my ground, refusing to be intimidated. "You've already lost, Karen," I said calmly. "The neighborhood doesn't want you anymore. It's time to move on." She glared at me for a moment, then turned and stormed off. It was the last time I saw her. Karen's departure marked the end of an era in the neighborhood. Without her at the helm, the HOA became more lenient, and the atmosphere shifted almost overnight. People started painting their houses brighter colors, planting unconventional gardens, and even adding unique features to their homes, something that would have been unthinkable under Karen's rule. My castle, once seen as a rebellious eyesore, was now celebrated as a symbol of individuality and freedom. Kids in the neighborhood would gather around it, pretending to be knights and dragons, and it became a popular spot for photos during holidays and special occasions. But the real victory came when the HOA officially revised its bylaws. The new rules allowed for more creative expression, as long as it didn't pose a safety hazard or infringe on others' rights. It was a small but significant change, and I couldn't help but feel proud of the role I played in making it happen. The neighborhood felt more alive, more vibrant, and for the first time, it truly felt like a community. As for Karen, she disappeared from the neighborhood shortly after her removal from the HOA board. Rumor had it that she moved to another town, one with an even stricter HOA, where she could continue her reign of terror. I didn't care where she went as long as she was gone. Her house sat empty for months before finally being sold to a young couple who were thrilled to be part of a neighborhood that valued creativity and individuality. They even asked me for advice on how to decorate their backyard, and I happily obliged. My castle, meanwhile, continued to be a source of joy and inspiration. I added a few more features over time, like a small moat, complete with a footbridge, and a garden filled with medieval-themed plants. It became a local landmark, and people would often stop by to take pictures or just admire the craftsmanship. I even started hosting annual medieval nights where neighbors would dress up in costumes, and we'd have feasts and games in the backyard. It was a far cry from the quiet, cookie-cutter life I had initially expected when I moved in, but I wouldn't have had it any other way. One evening, as I stood on the balcony of my tower, watching the sunset over the neighborhood, I felt a sense of contentment that I hadn't felt in years. The battles with Karen, the endless letters and fines, the sleepless nights, it had all been worth it. I had stood up for myself, and in doing so, I had helped create a better, more inclusive community. The castle was more than just a structure. It was a testament to the power of perseverance and the importance of standing up for what you believe in. As I turned to go back inside, I noticed a group of kids playing near the moat, their laughter echoing through the evening air. One of them looked up at me and waved. "Hey, Mr. Castleman," he called out. "Can we come up and see the view?" I smiled and waved back. "Of course," I said. "Just be careful on the stairs." They scrambled up the tower, their excitement palpable, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The castle wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to the neighborhood, a symbol of what could happen when people came together to challenge the status quo. In the end, Karen's attempts to control the neighborhood had backfired spectacularly. Instead of crushing my spirit, she had inspired me to build something extraordinary. And in doing so, she had inadvertently given the neighborhood a gift, a reminder that rules are meant to serve people, not the other way around. The castle stood as a testament to that idea, a beacon of creativity and resilience in a world that often values conformity over individuality. As I locked up the tower for the night, I took one last look at the castle, its silhouette outlined against the darkening sky. It had started as a simple act of defiance, but it had become so much more. It was a home, a landmark, and a symbol of hope. And as I walked back to the house, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, I would always have my castle to remind me of what I was capable of. The story of the castle and the battle with Karen spread far beyond the neighborhood. News outlets picked it up, and I was invited to share my story on podcasts and talk shows. People from all over the country reached out to thank me for standing up to an overbearing HOA and inspiring them to do the same. It was overwhelming at times, but also incredibly rewarding. I had started this journey wanting nothing more than a little privacy, but I had ended up with so much more, a sense of purpose, a stronger community, and a castle that would stand as a reminder of what one person could achieve when they refused to back down. And so, as I sat in my backyard one evening, grilling steaks and listening to the sounds of the neighborhood, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The castle was more than just a structure. It was a legacy. And as long as it stood, it would serve as a reminder that sometimes the best way to fight back is to build something so extraordinary that no one can ignore it. The HOA had banned my fence, but in doing so, they had given me the opportunity to build a castle. And in the end, that was a victory worth celebrating.